The rain poured down hard that night, turning the city streets into flowing rivers. Jack hurried home, his jacket pulled over his head, cursing as he stepped into another puddle. Another failed job interview, another rejection email. At 32, he thought he'd be somewhere better in life. As he reached his apartment building, he noticed someone huddled in the doorway. A woman with dirty blonde hair sat with her knees pulled to her chest, a thin blanket wrapped around her shoulders. She looked up as he approached, and Jack felt something stir inside him. Despite the dirt on her face and the worn-out clothes, her eyes shone with a fierce pride. "Sorry," she said, her voice surprisingly gentle. "I'll move." Jack hesitated. He should just walk past her, go upstairs to his empty apartment, heat up some noodles, and forget about her. But something stopped him. "It's pouring out here," he said. "Do you have somewhere to go?" The woman shook her head slightly, her wet hair sticking to her face. Jack took a deep breath. "I have a couch, just for tonight." She looked at him with suspicion. "I don't need your charity." "It's not charity, it's basic human decency. Plus, I hate eating alone." After a long moment she nodded and stood up, gathering a small backpack that contained all her belongings. Jack noticed she was taller than he expected, maybe in her late 20s, with a grace that didn't match her current situation. Upstairs, Jack's apartment was small but clean. The woman, Rose, she told him, stood awkwardly by the door. "Bathroom's there if you want to clean up," Jack said. "I can lend you some clothes. They'll be big, but they're dry." Rose disappeared into the bathroom for nearly half an hour. When she emerged, her face was clean, revealing high cheekbones and full lips. Jack's old t-shirt hung on her frame, and his sweatpants were rolled up several times at her ankles. "Thank you," she said simply. Jack heated up some soup and made grilled cheese sandwiches. They ate in silence at first, until Jack asked, "How long have you been on the streets?" 8 months, Rose replied, her fingers tightening around the spoon. "Before that, I had a studio apartment. Before that, I had dreams." "What kind of dreams?" "I'm an artist, or I was." Her lips curved into a bitter smile. "Turns out you can't eat paintings." Jack nodded, understanding the struggle of pursuing a passion. "What happened?" "Gallery owner promised me a show, convinced me to quit my day job. Then he disappeared with my money and my best work. Couldn't pay rent, couldn't find a new job fast enough." She shrugged as if it didn't matter, but her eyes told a different story. After dinner, Jack gave her blankets for the couch. As he turned to go to his bedroom, Rose called out to him. "Wait," she said, picking up a napkin. "Do you have a pen?" Jack handed her one, curious. Rose bent over the napkin, her hand moving quickly, confidently. When she handed it back, Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was him, his face captured in simple black lines, but somehow she had seen past his tired eyes and forced smile. She had drawn him as he wanted to be seen, strong, kind, with possibility in his eyes. "It's not much of a thank you," she said softly. "It's beautiful," Jack whispered, genuinely moved. "You're very talented." For the first time that night, Rose truly smiled, and Jack felt something shift between them, a connection, fragile but real. As he lay in bed that night, listening to the rain against his window, Jack couldn't stop thinking about the woman sleeping on his couch and the unexpected warmth her presence had brought to his lonely apartment. Jack woke up earlier than usual, the memory of his unexpected guest rushing back to him. He got out of bed quickly, hoping she hadn't left yet. But as he walked into the living room, he found only neatly folded blankets on the couch. Rose was gone. Jack sighed, disappointed but not surprised. He noticed something on the coffee table, the napkin with his portrait, weighed down by a small stone. Beneath it was another napkin with a simple "thank you" written on it. He sat down, staring at the drawing. Even in such a simple sketch, her talent was clear. He couldn't get her face out of his mind or the story she had told him. An artist thrown onto the streets because of someone else's dishonesty. 3 days passed, with Jack looking for Rose every time he walked through the neighborhood. He told himself he just wanted to make sure she was okay, but he knew there was more to it. On the 4th day, he finally spotted her sitting on a bench in the small park near his building. She wore the same clothes as when he first met her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She was drawing on a piece of cardboard with a broken pencil, completely focused on her work. "Rose," he called out, walking toward her. She looked up, surprise crossing her face before she composed herself. Jack. I've been looking for you, he said, sitting down beside her. You left without saying goodbye. I'm not good at goodbyes, she replied, covering her drawing with her hand. Or thank yous, apparently. Jack smiled. Your drawing said it all. He hesitated, then decided to just say what he had been thinking. I have a proposition for you. Rose's eyes narrowed with suspicion. What kind of proposition? A business one, Jack said quickly. Your art, it's really good. Like professionally good. Used to be, she said flatly. Still is, he insisted. Look, I have a spare room. It's small, but it's private. You could stay there and I could provide art supplies. You create and I try to sell your work. We split whatever we make. Rose stared at him. Why would you do that? Because I think you're talented and nobody should lose their dream because of one bad person. He looked away, then added more quietly, and because my apartment felt less empty with you in it. Rose was silent for a long moment, studying his face. What's the catch? No catch. 1 month trial. If it doesn't work out, no hard feelings. You can leave whenever you want. She looked down at her cardboard drawing, a half-finished sketch of the park. I don't need rescuing. I'm not offering rescue, I'm offering partnership. Jack pulled out his phone and showed her some photos. This is my attempt at an app design. I'm trying to break into development myself. We're both chasing something that feels just out of reach. Their eyes met, and Jack felt that same connection from the other night, like a thin thread stretching between them. Rose's lips parted slightly as she looked at him, her gaze moving from his eyes to his mouth, then quickly away. 1 month, she said finally, and I cook half the meals. I'm not going to be a charity case. Deal, Jack said, trying not to show how pleased he was. And fair warning, I'm a terrible cook, so that's actually doing me a favor. That got a small smile from her. As they walked back to his apartment together, their hands brushed accidentally. Jack felt a warmth spread through him at the brief contact, and he noticed Rose's cheeks flush slightly. In the apartment, Rose stood in the center of the spare room. It was small, with just a twin bed and a desk, but the window offered good light. It's perfect, she whispered. Jack leaned against the doorframe, watching her. So we're really doing this? Rose turned to him, and for a moment, he saw vulnerability beneath her tough exterior. I don't know why, but I trust you, she said softly. Just don't make me regret it. I won't, he promised, knowing he meant it more than he'd meant anything in a long time. 2 weeks passed quickly. The spare room transformed as Rose made it her own. Jack had bought her canvases, paints, brushes, and easels, more supplies than she had owned in years. She worked for hours each day, losing herself in her art while Jack worked on his app development at the kitchen table. At first, they moved around each other carefully, like dancers learning new steps, but soon a comfortable routine formed. Rose made coffee in the mornings, strong and black the way they both liked it. Jack cooked dinner when he remembered, though Rose's simple meals were much better. They shared the small space with growing ease, their initial awkwardness fading. One evening, Jack returned home from another disappointing meeting with potential investors. He had pitched his app idea to 3 different companies and all had passed. His shoulders slumped as he opened the apartment door. The smell hit him first, something rich and savory, then music, soft and low. Rose stood at the stove, her back to him, swaying slightly to the rhythm. She wore one of his old t-shirts as a smock, now covered in paint splatters. Her hair was piled messily on top of her head, with loose strands framing her face. You're staring, she said without turning around. Jack smiled. How did you know I was here? I always know. She turned then, and the look in her eyes made his heart skip. Rough day. That obvious. Rose nodded and pointed to the table, already set for dinner. Sit. Eat. Tell me. Over the meal? A pasta dish that was the best thing Jack had eaten in months. He told her about the rejections. Rose listened without interrupting, her eyes never leaving his face. They're idiots, she said when he finished. Your idea is good. They're just too blind to see it. Maybe, Jack sighed. What about you? How was your day? Rose hesitated, then stood up and led him to her room. I finished something. On the easel was a large canvas. Jack's breath caught when he saw it. The painting showed a city at dawn, buildings silhouetted against a sky of deep purples and oranges. But it wasn't just any city, it was their neighborhood, viewed from their rooftop. In the foreground, a small figure sat alone, watching the sunrise. "It's how I felt that first morning," Rose explained softly, "after you found me." Like maybe the dark was ending, Jack stared at the painting, emotion tightening his throat. He turned to look at her and found her much closer than he expected. He could see flecks of gold in her green eyes, a small scar above her right eyebrow, the curve of her lower lip. "It's beautiful," he said, his voice rough. "It's yours," she replied. Without thinking, Jack reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. Rose didn't pull away. Her skin was warm under his fingers, and he let his hand linger on her cheek. She leaned into his touch, just slightly, her eyes darkening. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility. Jack leaned forward, drawn to her by something he couldn't name. Rose's lips parted, her breath quickening. Then the timer in the kitchen went off, loud and insistent. They jumped apart, the spell broken. "Dessert," Rose said, her cheeks flushed as she hurried out of the room. That night, Jack lay awake, thinking about how close he had come to kissing her, how much he had wanted to. But that wasn't their arrangement. She was his business partner, his roommate, maybe his friend. Wanting more felt like taking advantage. In the next room, Rose also lay awake, her fingers touching her cheek where his hand had been. She had almost kissed him. And part of her, a growing part, wished that timer had never gone off. Neither knew that the other was awake, thinking the same thoughts, separated only by a thin wall and their own doubts. The almost kiss hung between Jack and Rose over the next few days. They moved around each other cautiously, both pretending nothing had happened while being painfully aware of each other's presence. Jack threw himself into his work, staying later at the coffee shop where he usually coded. Rose painted with a new intensity, often skipping meals and working well into the night. One morning, Jack received an unexpected email from a gallery owner named David. The man claimed to have seen Rose's paintings in Jack's social media posts and expressed interest in displaying her work. Jack read the email 3 times, hardly believing their luck. "Rose," he called out, bursting into her room without knocking. She stood by the window in a tank top and pajama shorts, the morning light catching in her hair. Jack froze, momentarily forgetting why he had entered. "What is it?" she asked, turning to face him. There was a smudge of blue paint on her cheek. Jack swallowed hard and forced himself to focus. "Someone wants your art, a gallery owner. He wants to meet this afternoon." Rose's eyes widened. "Are you serious?" "Completely." Jack handed her his phone. "I've been posting your work online. Hope that's okay." Rose scanned the email, her hands trembling slightly. "Jack, this is real." "It's real," he confirmed, grinning. "We did it." Without warning, Rose threw her arms around his neck. Jack caught her automatically, his hands finding her waist. The embrace was warm and tight, her body pressed against his. He could smell her shampoo, feel her heart beating fast against his chest. When she pulled back, their faces were inches apart. This time, there was no timer to interrupt them. Jack leaned down slowly, giving her time to pull away. Instead, Rose rose up on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was gentle at first, hesitant and questioning. Then Rose's fingers tangled in his hair, and Jack's arms tightened around her waist. The kiss deepened, months of tension dissolving in the heat between them. Jack backed her against the wall, his hands sliding under her tank top to touch the warm skin of her back. Rose made a small sound in the back of her throat that nearly undid him. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathing hard. Rose looked up at him, her lips swollen, her eyes dark with desire. "I've wanted to do that since that night in the rain," Jack admitted, his voice low. "I've wanted you to," she whispered back. They might have forgotten the gallery meeting entirely if Jack's phone hadn't chimed with a reminder. Rose glanced at the time and swore softly. "We have 2 hours," she said, reluctantly stepping out of his embrace. "I need to get ready." Jack nodded, suddenly unsure. Rose, about what just happened. She placed a finger against his lips. "Later. We'll talk about it later." There was a promise in her eyes that made Jack's heart race. The gallery was smaller than Jack had imagined, but well located in an upscale part of town. David, the owner, was a tall man with silver hair and an expensive suit. His eyes lit up when they unwrapped Rose's paintings. These are extraordinary, he said, examining each one carefully. The emotion, the technique. Where did you study? Self-taught, Rose replied, fidgeting slightly under his scrutiny. David raised an eyebrow. Even more impressive. He turned to Jack. And you're her manager? Jack glanced at Rose. Partner, he corrected. David studied them both, a knowing smile touching his lips. I want to display these in my gallery. Small exhibition, 2 weeks from now. Rose's hand found Jack's and squeezed tight. Really? Really? David named a price for each painting that made Jack's jaw drop. And I want first option on your future work. Outside, after signing the contract, they stood on the sidewalk in stunned silence. Then Rose let out a laugh that was half sob and threw herself into Jack's arms again. This time when they kissed, it was in full view of passers-by, neither of them caring who saw. We did it, Rose whispered against his lips, her eyes shining with tears and joy. Jack held her close, his heart full. This is just the beginning. That night, they walked home hand in hand, stopping every few blocks to kiss under streetlights. The excitement of the gallery deal mixed with the heady rush of finally giving in to their feelings. By the time they reached the apartment, the air between them crackled with electricity. Jack unlocked the door with unsteady hands. As soon as it closed behind them, Rose was in his arms again. Her kisses were urgent now, hungry. Jack backed her against the wall, his hands sliding down to lift her. Rose wrapped her legs around his waist, gasping as he pressed against her. Bedroom, she whispered against his ear, her breath hot on his skin. Jack carried her there, laying her down on his bed. In the dim light filtering through the curtains, Rose looked up at him with eyes full of trust and desire. Jack paused, his heart pounding. Are you sure? He asked, his voice rough. In answer, Rose pulled her shirt over her head, then reached for him. I've never been more sure of anything. What followed was everything they had both been dreaming of for weeks. Their bodies moved together perfectly, as if they had always been meant to find each other. Afterward, they lay tangled in the sheets, Rose's head on Jack's chest, his fingers tracing patterns on her bare back. I've wanted this since that first night, Jack admitted, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Rose smiled against his skin. Me too. But I was afraid. Of what? Of needing someone again. Of letting myself be vulnerable. She propped herself up on her elbow to look at him. My life fell apart once. I didn't want to risk it happening again. Jack tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. And now? Now I think some risks are worth taking, she kissed him softly. The next 2 weeks were a blur of preparation for the exhibition. Rose painted with renewed energy and passion, creating 3 new pieces specifically for the show. Jack balanced his time between helping her and continuing work on his app, which was finally starting to gain some interest from investors. The night before the exhibition, Rose was too nervous to sleep. Jack found her in her studio at 3 in the morning, staring at her paintings. What if no one likes them? She asked without turning around. What if I'm not good enough? Jack wrapped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. You are brilliant. Your work is brilliant. And even if no one else sees it, I do. Rose turned in his arms, her eyes searching his face. When did you become the most important person in my life? Probably around the same time you became mine, Jack replied, his voice soft with wonder. The exhibition opening was more crowded than they expected. David had invited art critics, collectors, and other gallery owners. Rose gripped Jack's hand tightly as they entered, overwhelmed by the number of people studying her work. A renowned critic approached them, champagne glass in hand. Your perspective is extraordinary, he told Rose. The way you capture light and emotion, it's rare to see such authentic work. Throughout the evening, red sold dots appeared beside painting after painting. By the end of the night, every piece had been purchased, some for even higher prices than David had originally suggested. Later, as they prepared to leave, a woman in an expensive suit introduced herself as the director of a prestigious art residency program. We have an opening starting next month in our New York studio. 6 months, all expenses paid. We'd love to have you join us. Rose's face lit up with excitement, then fell as she glanced at Jack. The residency would mean moving across the country, away from him, away from the life they had just begun building together. The woman noticed the look that passed between them. Think about it, she said, handing Rose her card. You have tremendous talent. This could launch your career internationally. As they walked home that night, their earlier joy was tempered by the weight of the decision hanging between them. Their fingers remained intertwined, but both were lost in their own thoughts, wondering what this new opportunity might mean for their future together. 3 days passed with the residency offer hanging between them like an uninvited guest. Rose spent hours in her studio, painting with a new urgency. Jack threw himself into his app development, staying late at the coffee shop rather than facing the inevitable conversation waiting at home. The money from the gallery sales had been split between them as agreed. Rose had more cash in her bank account than she'd ever seen, certainly enough to rent her own place. Jack's app had finally secured modest funding from an investor who had attended the exhibition. Their original arrangement had officially succeeded beyond their wildest hopes, but success had brought complications neither had anticipated. One evening, Jack returned home later than usual. The apartment was dark except for a sliver of light under Rose's studio door. He hesitated before knocking softly. "Come in," she called. Rose stood before a new canvas, larger than any she'd worked on before. Jack's breath caught when he saw what she was painting. It was him. Not a simple portrait, but Jack as she saw him. In the painting, he stood with his back partly turned, looking toward a bright horizon. His face was in profile, showing determination and hope. The brushwork was bold, confident, capturing his essence in a way that made his chest tighten with emotion. "Rose," he whispered, unable to find other words. She set down her brush, not meeting his eyes. "I've been working on this series. For the residency application." She gestured to several other canvases leaning against the wall. Each showed Jack in different moments, sleeping, working at his laptop, laughing. Jack moved closer to examine them. Each painting revealed how deeply she had been watching him, how completely she understood him. "They're all me," he said softly. Rose nodded, finally looking at him. "I tried painting other things. Nothing else would come." The meaning behind her words hung in the air between them. "You're taking the residency then?" Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral. "I should." Rose ran a hand through her hair, leaving a streak of blue paint. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime." "I know. My flight leaves next week. I already accepted." Jack felt as if the floor had disappeared beneath him. "When were you going to tell me?" "Tonight. That's why I was waiting up." Her voice was steady, but her eyes betrayed her pain. "This was always temporary, Jack. Our arrangement." "Our arrangement?" Jack repeated, anger rising in his chest. "Is that what you call what happened between us?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean, Rose? Because it seems like you made this decision without even talking to me." "Because I knew what would happen if we talked," she shot back, her composure cracking. "I knew you would look at me with those eyes and I would stay, and I would regret it forever." "So I'm holding you back. Is that it?" "No." Rose's voice broke. "But I've spent my whole life giving up dreams for other people. I can't do it again, even for you." Jack stepped back as if she'd slacked him. "I would never ask you to give up your dreams. You wouldn't have to ask." Tears spilled down Rose's cheeks. "That's the problem." They stared at each other, the distance between them suddenly vast despite standing only feet apart. "I found you in the rain," Jack said quietly. "I watched you create again. I fell in love with you. And now you're leaving." Rose reached for him, but Jack stepped away. "You should go," he said, his voice hollow. "Take the residency. Become the artist you were meant to be. You don't owe me anything." "Jack, please." He couldn't bear to hear whatever she was about to say. "I need some air." He walked out of the apartment, not looking back to see Rose sink to the floor among her paintings of him, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Outside, rain began to fall, just as it had the night they first met. 6 months passed like a slow-moving dream. Jack threw himself into his work, and his app finally launched to modest success. The money was good, better than he'd ever made before. He moved to a larger apartment in a nicer building, but somehow the extra space only made him feel more alone. He followed Rose's career from a distance. The art blogs praised her work at the residency. Her paintings sold for increasingly impressive sums. He saved every article, every photo of her standing beside her latest creation, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Jack hadn't kept any of her paintings except the first one, The City at Dawn. It hung in his bedroom where he could see it every morning, a reminder of what might have been. One evening, an email arrived from David, the gallery owner. A major auction house was selling one of Rose's paintings from her Unknown Man series, the portraits of Jack she had been working on before she left. The auction was happening the next day in New York. Without giving himself time to reconsider, Jack booked a flight. The auction room was crowded with wealthy collectors and art dealers. Jack felt out of place in his only good suit, but no one paid him any attention. He flipped through the catalog until he found it, Horizon, the painting of him looking toward a bright future, the painting she had been working on the night they argued. When the piece came up for bidding, the room buzzed with excitement. The auctioneer started at a price that made Jack wince, but he raised his paddle anyway. Other bidders quickly pushed the price higher. Jack stayed in as long as he could, but eventually the amount surpassed what he could afford. He lowered his paddle, a familiar hollowness filling his chest as a man in the front row won the painting. After the auction, Jack sat in the hotel bar, nursing a drink and wondering what had possessed him to come. What had he expected? That buying her painting would somehow bring her back. "You bid on my painting." The voice froze him in place. Slowly, Jack turned around. Rose stood there, more beautiful than he remembered. Her hair was shorter now, her clothes expensive, but her eyes were the same, green with flecks of gold, watching him carefully. "Rose," he breathed. "What are you doing here?" "I saw you in the audience." She sat down beside him. "I pulled the painting from the auction after you left." Jack stared at her. "You can do that? When it's your own work and you offer the auction house something better, yes." She smiled slightly. "I have it outside. I thought you might still want it." "Why?" Jack asked, his voice rough with emotion. Rose looked down at her hands. "Because it's yours. It's always been yours." She took a deep breath. "I was wrong to leave the way I did." "You weren't wrong to take the opportunity," Jack said. "You deserved it. The residency was everything I thought it would be. My career is taking off. I have money, recognition." She looked up at him, her eyes glistening. "And none of it means anything without you." Jack's heart hammered in his chest. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I can paint anywhere. I don't need a residency program to be an artist. But I do need," she reached for his hand, "I do need the man who found me in the rain. The man who believed in me when I'd stopped believing in myself." Jack twined his fingers with hers. "I never stopped loving you," he admitted, "not for a single day." "I need to show you something," Rose said softly. Outside, a car waited with the painting inside. Jack unwrapped it carefully, his breath catching when he saw it. It wasn't Horizon as he expected. It was a new painting, a man and woman standing together in the rain, the darkness around them giving way to light. "It's us," Rose explained. "The beginning and the ending. I've tried to paint it 100 times over the last 6 months." Jack looked from the painting to her face. "Is this really the ending?" Rose shook her head, stepping closer to him. "No, it's another beginning if you want it to be." Jack pulled her into his arms, holding her the way he'd dreamed of for months. "The homeless girl who made me rich," he whispered against her hair. "Rich?" she asked, looking up at him. "Not with money." Jack brushed a tear from her cheek. "With everything that actually matters." As they kissed in the soft evening light, both finally understood that true wealth had nothing to do with bank accounts or success, and everything to do with finding the person who sees you, really sees you, and chooses to stay.